Hello, everyone. My name is John Miller, president of Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the second episode in our webinar series, Grace and Speed, Muskoka's Wooden Boats. First, we'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples who, for thousands of years before us, were and are still the keepers and caretakers of this land where we now live and work. We're dedicated to honoring the Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. In particular, for Muskoka, all four cultures: Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Métis that inhabited these lands either currently or historically. We recognize all the generations of Indigenous people and their historic connection to this place, and we're grateful for the opportunity to gather here at this time. This series is a digital component of our $8 million revitalization project at the Muskoka Discovery Center. The physical transformation of our building is almost complete, with 3 dynamic exhibits growing and evolving with inspired content. The 3 exhibits are The Evolution of Muskoka, a story about how, through a process of conflict and resolution, this storied area of Ontario evolved after first contact to become one of the most important tourist destinations in the world. The second exhibit is Miskoaki, Confluence of Cultures. This is a presentation about 4 Indigenous cultures with a presence in Muskoka for thousands of years, all of which have teachings to share about sustainability and care for our environment. And the third exhibit is Wanda 3. Wanda is our 108-year-old steam yacht that was commissioned by Mrs. Timothy Eaton in 1915. We're presently in the middle of an electrification repowerment for Wanda, and she'll be a working artifact and an important symbol of sustainability once complete. The Muskoka Steamship and Discovery Center, in partnership with Antique and Classic Boat Society, is excited to present this series of 8 webinars showcasing wooden works of art that have made Muskoka home to arguably the best concentration of quality wooden boats in the world. Our volunteer team of Chris Bullen, who, by the way, captured all the video and still images, Ian Turnbull, Mary Story, Murray Walker, Ed Skinner, and Rick Terry, along with many boat owners, have put in countless hours to produce this series, and we're extremely grateful for their contributions. I'd also like to thank Jordan Waynes and Ann Curley, who are working behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. The entire series will be when complete, will be available in our archives, on our website, and as a permanent display within the Muskoka Discovery Center. Now, so during the webinar, we encourage you, the audience, to post questions in our Q&A, and we'll read them to our panelists. Excuse me. If your question's already been posted, then click like beside that question and it'll be moved up in priority. We can't answer all the questions, so if you really want one answered, please email it to us in the address provided in the chat and we'll get the answer back to you. Okay, that's enough of me. Please enjoy our presentation and we'll see you for Q&A in about 40 minutes.
Good afternoon and welcome to episode 2 of Muskoka Wooden Boat Stories, brought to you by Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center and by the Antique and Classic Boat Society of Toronto. I'm Ian Turnbull, hosting this series on behalf of our production team comprising Chris Bullen, Murray Walker, Mary Story, Rick Terry, and Ed Skinner. Last week we met 3 boats built in the early days of Muskoka wooden boat building. Rita was built by Burt Minette in Bracebridge in 1914, and Landsakes in 1919 by the Barnum & Boat Works in Gravenhurst, and Robin Adair in 1927 at Ditchburns in Gravenhurst. This is the second of 8 episodes featuring films shot by Chris Bullen last summer, along with presentations I have assembled to set the context for each film. There's live discussion with our production team at the end of each episode, and we welcome your questions, so please try to stump us. It's important to mention that this is a zero-budget, volunteer-driven project. As far as we know, the boats have not previously been documented in a webinar format like this, and we've had a great time doing it. But we can't tell the story in just one season. So we plan to continue this project in the coming summer. We hope this makes you hungry for more information available in many books on the subject. And of course, a great resource is the Muskoka Steamship and Discovery Center, and especially the archives there. And now on to the boats featured in episode 2. On a sunny day last summer, we met with Andy Chisholm in his boathouse to film 4 boats in his collection, the first 3 all built by Minette Shields in Bracebridge. Nanawa 2 is a 34-foot displacement launch built in 1928. Black Knight, an 18-foot gentleman's racer built in 1934. And Black Prince, also built in 1934 but 21 feet long. And 36-foot Lady Elgin, built in 1929 by Ditchburn. If Nanawa could talk, she'd tell you her first home was on Wistow Island in Lake Rosso, living in the same boathouse as the yacht Rambler that we met in episode 1. Both boats were owned by Mr. E.B. Whitcomb. Above Nanawa's ornate instrument panel is the dash plate confirming her origin. And Nanawa might also say that in the late 70s, long after Rambler had moved elsewhere, the launch Lady Elgin moved into the adjacent slip. Today, Nanawa and Lady Elgin are reunited in Andy Chisholm's boathouse, as we soon shall see. 18-foot Black Knight is one of 6 gentlemen's racers built by Minette Shields in 1933 and 34, with the engine in front of the cockpit, like a little sports car on the water, as Andy says. In the smaller picture, taken decades ago, she is barreling along, driven by prior owner Tim Chisholm. 1934 was a busy year for Minette Shields. Besides the gentlemen's racers, they built 4 21-foot 2-cockpit sports runabouts like Black Prince, with the engine behind the driver. Lady Elgin was custom built in 1929 as a tour boat for Captain Henry Wallace of Minette. Hers is a great story, but we're saving it for episode 7, which features boats used commercially for many decades. We learned about Bert Minette's early years in last week's episode. That's him on the left. By the mid-20s, his insistence on perfection consumed the profit and the business was struggling. Enter socially adept, well-connected Bryson Shields, who was a savvy businessman. The two were complementary. The firm's advertising said it all. Behind its beauty, correct design. Beneath its surface, skilled construction. And now let's witness that beauty and skilled construction in the film. Listen carefully to the conversation between Andy Chisholm and Maria Walker. You'll hear phrases like form and function, thrill and art. It's hard to describe the essence of the boats in words, but Andy and Murray come close.
Talking about old boats, it always interests me where the interest in an old boat or your experience with an old boat started. What's yours in this case?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint to one thing, but there have always been these types of boats in the family. My dad, I came up to Muskoka first as, almost nothing, and my dad rented for a long time, and we bought our cottage. But before that, he used to come up in the late 30s. He started coming up to his uncle's place in Bala. And so Dad always had these stories. The uncle had, Uncle Tim Chisholm, he had a Minette. I can't remember what year. It was called the Sean Rue. And my dad used to tell all these stories around the dinner table all the time about. It was a racing boat, and they used to have a race around Bala Bay Harbor, or around the bay, just the interior bay, and it was a big race. There's a cup that actually I've still got upstairs, a big shiny silver cup. And Dad used to tell these stories about the night before the race, the uncle would say, okay, we got to take all the seats out, we got to take all the paddles out, we got to get everything out of this boat so that we can be as fast as we can. and then put the bear grease on the bottom was the story for the kids. But anyway, those sort of stories and legends and the old pictures and so on were always kind of around. And my dad started collecting some boats relatively early on in his career, and my uncle Tim, as you know, was a tremendous boat collector, and so it's always kind of been around. But for me, it's also an important part of the lore of Muskoka. One of those special characteristics, somewhat defining aspects that make Muskoka different than another place. And that history is very rich.
Well, there's no doubt the quality of Muskoka boats has earned a reputation not only in North America, but it's spread even into Europe. And I imagine you've come at it the same way, looking at the tremendous history of Muskoka boat building and the impeccable quality of what was produced here.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating to read what went on and the way in which all these entrepreneurs developed their business and created just tremendous craftsmanship that has stood the test of time and is still valued. Whenever I have guests, whether they be from here, but notably from Europe or the US or other places, they are blown away. They can't believe the craftsmanship in these boats, and the fact that there are so many that are still active, still in service, still providing a lot of fun and interest. I think it's remarkable. It's just sad that given the crash in the late 20s and the depression that followed for a decade after that very few of them were able to persist afterwards.
Yes.
But that period of time, 20, 30 years, pretty remarkable.
That to me was the zenith of boat building in Muskoka, that there was such an adventuresome way of looking at design. And of course, when we look at it now from our generation, we started looking at it from a nostalgia point of view, and then there was the question of how well we could restore a boat. But then that phase that I think we're in now, and I'm not sure that that's going to leave, is that we're really looking at an art form. It's form and function. And what's your view on that?
For sure. I think the characteristic lines of a Minette or a Minette Shields or a ditch burn or whatever that have either soft or more formal lines to them, they're just remarkable. And when you're in the boat and you're traveling along, perhaps on a sunset cruise or something, and the sun is reflecting off the deck, and you see those lines and the way it cuts through the water, and some of these big wakeboard boats might come by with an enormous wake, it just cuts right through. It's incredible.
This morning we had the wonderful opportunity of watching some displacement boats that you were driving, as you say, knifing through the water in a very smooth way. But then we got into an incredibly fun part, watching you with several other people that came to visit us with similar boats, and you guys were just having a lot of fun out there. What's your sense, again, driving something like Black Knight, where you can rip along on the top of the water?
It is remarkable. It's like being in a two-seater, an old-style two-seater Jag or something. Mm-hmm. And the beauty is, as different from an automobile, you're just right there with the water spraying right beside you, so you can just touch it right there. And the power that these boats have, and the speed, the excitement, the thrill of that is incredible. But you combine that performance and the thrill and the excitement of it with the craftsmanship, and that's just unbelievable to me.
And that to me is one of the real magical things now, when so many young people are talking about a fiberglass boat and how fast they go. When we start to compare it with the kind of boats that you were driving this morning, where you're basically ripping around the island with the others, to me that's the kind of thing that I think young people are most enamored by. And I wonder whether you experience the same sort of thing when you pull into a marina with Black Knight or something that's a little sports car on the water.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly a number of these boats gather attention in part because of their scarcity or some sort of rareness to them. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people genuinely appreciate that quality, that craftsmanship, and they can pick it out from everything else, not just because it's wooden, because it's made in a particular way with superior quality and a real design sense that is incredible. It's got a sense, as you said, of art and design to it. And I think that appreciation is widely felt. But what I notice also with certainly the next generation in our family is they can appreciate that quality as well. And while they may not use them as much as I would like them to, in part because sometimes they're fearful of, my goodness, I'll maybe put a scratch or something in it. But actually they love getting out and being behind the wheel of a sunset cruise and appreciating all that.
You mentioned your son drives the boats on a regular basis.
Yes, and I must admit he drives them better than I do. He's had fewer years, but he's packed a lot of reps in. He likes getting out in them. He likes, as you said, the thrill of the black night, but then the grace of the Nanawha. Mm-hmm. He likes both those things and really appreciates them. And I think the whole family does. My daughter Lauren and my wife as well. I'd like to encourage them both to drive them more and realize that they're both tremendous boat drivers in their own right. They do just fine in these boats. My son seems to be a little bit fearless when it comes to all that.
But it's good there's that appreciation in the family, and as you and I chatted about earlier, we also have an appreciation of how fortunate we are to have collected a number of boats like these. We've been able to preserve them and keep them in Canada, and to be able to share them with others, whether it be at a boat show or a shared cruise. And it was reassuring this morning to say that, yeah, we both feel lucky as collectors that we're able to do that. And keep it in Muskoka.
First of all, we have to feel tremendously fortunate that we can experience Muskoka. We have to feel tremendously fortunate that we have the means to be able to buy a place in an area like this, and we can't take any of that for granted. That is good fortune. And yet for me, the added good fortune of being able to share in some of these special and characteristic aspects of the place, i.e. some of these older boats and the experiences that come with them, is something really special. And I feel selfish in a way because I've got this opportunity and I enjoy it, and enjoy it with friends, but not enough people get to enjoy it. But also at the same time, I feel for those that perhaps have that connection, understand the sense of community in Muskoka, have a desire to extend and perpetuate that sense of community in Muskoka, which is more and more difficult as it grows. And that sense of community tied back in part to the history and the specialness of these boats, and going even back before them to the steamships and so on and so forth. It's important to try to keep that alive, in my view. It's part of that community feeling. It's part of being able to keep it going for the broader community at large.
I do look at it as a responsibility, but then as we showed this morning, it's also a whole lot of fun at the same time. So it's a wonderful blend that I think will help to perpetuate this wonderful sport.
No, that's exactly it. Everybody says, well, I guess you don't use them very much, and perhaps I feel a little bit odd sometimes. I say, well, I take it to go play golf, and I take it to go into Port Carling, and I take them for a sunset cruise, and I take them when we've got family who just wants to go for a boat ride. And I've got one or two other boats that we can use if we're just going point to point, but I use them a lot for just mundane things. It just gives so much joy.
Well, that's how they started out their life, and isn't it great that we've continued that? So
that's exactly right. One of the boats that we didn't film, it's not that old, was a 78 Gravette that my dad bought called Sandbar. Sandbar being Stephen, Andrew, Barbara. It was before our further sibling David came along, but we said the D is for you. But anyway, it comes from running it aground as teenagers, running it aground on a sandbar, and all agreeing that maybe we would call it Sandbar. But we used it for water skiing. We used it to take stuff to the dump. We used it to transport a refrigerator across. I mean, it was an everything boat. And today, people look at it and say, "Oh, geez, this looks a little bit Kennedy-esque or Camelot-esque with its design sense."
But it was a great example of form and function, and you're taking garbage as well.
Precisely.
They can be used for everything. Super.
The Nanawa's got a couple of distinctive characteristics, as do each of these boats. They've all got their own personality, but they've also got their own special characteristic. But in the Nanawa, there's a couple. One is a faceplate for the dials. It's quite ornate, but similar to one or two others that I've seen. But just above that somewhat ornate plate, there's a little engraving, which was basically from showing the manufacturer delivering it to E.B. Whitcomb, who was the original owner of this 1928 boat. And so just seeing that connection back to its first owner and the engraving there for E.B. Whitcomb, delivered by and that notion was really special. But then also in the front, there's a plaque that a guest to Wistow Island, where Nanawa spent most of its life before I was fortunate enough to purchase it. And a guest to Wistow Island, I don't know whether it was Henry Wilson's guest or prior to that the Whitcombs, but the plaque says Nanawa 2. There's a whole another story about Nanawa 1, but Nanawa 2, but they misspelled it. Naniwa with an I is a Japanese word, evidently. I don't speak Japanese, but a Japanese word for fast wave. And the guest had given this plaque. It was a terrific gift, but it had Nanawa with an A in the middle instead of an I. So with their grace, the owners then took the nameplate off the back, which said Nanawa with an I, Nanawa 2, and changed it to have an A so that it was consistent. Problem is, on the side plates, it also says Nanawa where the lights are, and it stays with the I. I don't know whether they could not fit the A in there somehow.
Interesting. Of all the years I've looked at Nanawa, that's something I did not know. So that's a great story. Thank you.
Welcome back. As we meet two fast craft built in the 30s by Herb Ditchburn and now owned by Stuart Robertson. L'Aiglon is a 22-foot gentleman's racer built in 1931. And Aegis 6, a 22-foot forward drive built in 1936. The origin of the Ditchburn racers like L'Aiglon goes back to 1920 when famed powerboat racer Harry Greening, on the right on your screen, ordered Rainbow 1 from Herb Ditchburn, lower right. Rainbow 1 was the first of many racers the two would develop, featuring a V-bottom designed by George Crouch. Harry Greening, Herb Ditchburn, and Bert Minette not only shared a passion for boats, they also shared a common year of birth, 1880, and were in their prime in the early part of the last century. L'Aiglon, built in 1931, followed other racers built by Ditchburn, including B4 in 1921 and Dix in 1927. Here are the three boats. B4 was built for Carl Borntrigger of Lake Muskoka. We met him in the first episode as owner of the yacht Rita. This picture of B4 was taken in the 40s when the boat was owned by Cameron Peck, a wealthy American boat collector with a cottage on Lake of Bays. We'll meet 22-foot-long Dix in episode 4. She was built in 1927 for an American cottage on Lake Muskoka, lived for a period of time in the Cameron Peck collection on Lake of Bays, returned to Lake Muskoka, then Lake Joseph, and is now back on Lake Muskoka. And here is L'Aiglon, which means in French little eagle or eaglet. She is one of only several in a series called the Rainbow Junior. She was ordered in 1931 by Mrs. Georgia Foreman of Eagle Island in Lake Joseph. In episode 4 on April 13th, we will meet Eaglet 2, who, like L'Aiglon, lived on Eagle Island for many years. This is a portion of a note written in 2014 to Stuart Robertson from Georgia Foreman's granddaughter when he purchased L'Aiglon. Tonight is the last night the L'Aiglon will sit in her slip on Eagle Island. It has now been 83 years since my grandmother, Georgia Meade Green Foreman, had this Ditchburn made. The slip we have here was especially made to fit. Pause for a moment to think of the times, the people, and the places L'Aiglon has seen in her 91 years. 1932 was tough for Canada's boat building industry. In just 1 year, production and revenue fell by about 50%. Herb Ditchburn pressed on through bankruptcies in 1932 and 1935 and opened again in 1936. Aegis was built that year and demonstrates design popular at the time with forward drive and tilted windshields. The company folded for the last time in 1938. Aegis 6 is a good example of Ditchburn design in the late 30s. Not many boats of this design were built, but there is another named Convoy 2 that lives on Lake Muskoka. Look at the similarity in the two boats: bow stem, hardware, shear line, and transom treatment. Grateful to Stuart Robertson for finding Aegis 6, returning her to Muskoka, and having her restored. That's what stewardship is all about. The boat was originally built for an American family with a cottage in Lake of Bays. Stuart found it in New Hampshire after an online search for a Ditchburn. It was very much in need of restoration. Here's the boathead Dukes in the middle of the process. And now, Stuart Robertson's Boats as filmed last summer. You'll have to listen carefully as Murray Walker talks with Stuart. There's lots of background noise in the boathouse, making it a little hard to hear the dialogue.
Stuart, with any boat story, it seems to be a matter of where did it start? Where would your first interest in wooden boats begin?
Well, my parents came up to Lake Rosso, and my dad had, I'm guessing, 21-foot Duke utility, probably 1955 or thereabouts, called White Ways. And we used to go for lovely wooden boat rides around Muskoka and down in Lake Muskoka and get sunburned going through the locks.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, our first experience with boats.
Sounds good. And when you were able to get wooden boats of your own, I guess having a boathouse was probably the first big step. But you've picked two very interesting boats, both made by Ditchburn, but both quite different. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about the differences and what appealed to you about those boats?
Sure. Well, the first one, the bigger one, the triple cockpit, we live in London, England, and I was surfing the internet about 2003, 2004, and I thought, my dad's always liked Ditchburns, and I just put in Ditchburn, and this boat popped up, which was quite a horrible looking boat called Canadian Sunset. And I wasn't sure if it was really a Ditchburn or not, because you don't know anything, from the internet. I called the boat dealer on the highway in New Hampshire, and he said a survey had been done. He sent me the survey, and the next summer I brought it up to Muskoka and talked to Ed Skinner about it, and he checked his records. He had all the Buchanan engine information. They traced it back to a Lake of Bays family, so he thought it made sense that was probably Ditchburn, so I bought it on that wing and a prayer. And what appealed to me was, it was a nice size. It was actually kind of a unique looking, I think, triple cockpit with the design. And I was confident that, Ed and Dukes at the time could bring it back to life. So that's how we ended up with it.
And a superb job it is. I mean, bringing back the original kind of distinctive Muskoka deck with the tongue and groove boards. I mean, it's very much returned to its Canadian roots that way.
Yes.
But tell me about L'Aiglon, the other boat, which is also a Ditchburn.
Yeah, so L'Aiglon, I think I'd always liked gentlemen's races because my neighbor Andy Chisholm took me out in Black Knight, and I hadn't realized how comfortable it is sitting at the back and driving the boat from the back. And so I think I mentioned to Gary Clark that if anything came up, give me a call. And L'Aiglon came up, but almost 10 years ago. And at that point, the sides were black, painted black, and it had spondons at the stern, and it looked very different than the way it looks now. And Gary Clark and I took it out, and it rode very nicely. In fact, the K-Pock seats in the back are the same K-Pock. It was so comfortable. We had it recovered, but
they do have a habit of just nestling in.
Yeah,
being
exactly.
Perfect
Very
for your
comfortable.
body.
And it was what also appealed to me. It was the original owner's family had been in the same family for almost 90 years, and so it had good provenance, and it was a nice boat. And we thought we could probably, bring it back to what it was when it rolled off the factory floor in 1931. Well, and I think we succeeded.
I think you did, and congratulations to you for having done it the right way in such a quality manner. Now, this morning you were out with several other boats, basically ripping around the island here.
That was a lot of fun.
And L'Aiglon looked superb. I mean, the way it handles on the water looked exceptional.
Yeah, yes, you never know. It didn't have the original power, so we dropped in quite a large berg, and you never know how a boat's going to perform with the added engine. Although it's more power, less weight than the old engine because obviously new technology. But it actually turned out, I think, rather well. It handles nicely, and it goes fast enough to be a little scary.
But to me, it has this beautiful combination of form and function. It's a beautiful looking boat, but then to see it perform just balances the two elements so perfectly.
It does. It's interesting. I think it's called the Junior Rainbow. Rainbow was a big Ditchburn race boat that won, I think, the Gold Cup in the 20s and 30s, and this was a sporty miniature model. And I guess it has the same handling characteristics of its bigger brother.
It definitely has very strong rainbow characteristics.
Yeah.
Even right down to the tow rail with the same type of cedar on it.
Yes.
Very well done. Now, taking the next step, of course, you'll enjoy driving it, but I understand you have family members that also will drive.
We do. Well, my younger son, Ian, who's 27, he drives both boats. He's a very good boat driver. My L'Aiglon's much easier to drive than the Aegis because the Aegis pulls quite dramatically in reverse, whereas this is point and shoot, very easy to drive. So he drives both of them. My older son drives L'Aiglon. He hasn't driven this one yet. He wants some lessons. And my older daughter's coming to learn how to drive both. So that's a project this week. Sarah will learn how to drive both boats.
Good. I think that's really important because it's nice that we enjoy driving them, but in so many cases they can become a family heirloom.
Oh, that's right.
And I think it's important that younger people like to drive them. so many haven't had the experience of just how much fun it is to drive a wooden boat.
Well, the other thing that's fun is all of them saw both boats being refurbished in the shops, and it's fun to see, this boat that was my sons didn't want me to buy later on. They thought the black sides were ugly, and Barry thought he could make it better, and he did. And to see that whole process, I think, gives them some more ownership in that boat, and they saw the same with the bigger one.
Does your son get it, or either son get a kick out of driving it into a marina for fuel and having the oohs and ahs that happen?
I haven't asked that. They probably do. I certainly do.
Yeah, it's fun.
Well, people always want to ask stories. Everyone always asks what year and is that a ditch burn? It's funny. Yeah, we have 2 ditch burns. That's more, I think, coincidence. I do have dreams of getting a long deck launch. It's apparently most of the people on the lake do.
Yes, they are a coveted thing to have a long deck launch.
But I need a boathouse spot for that, and we'll figure it out eventually.
We featured boats demonstrating both grace and speed in this episode, and we'll visit more in episode 4. Concluding today, thank you to the original boat builders, restorers, and stewards past and present, especially Andy and Stuart. Thanks also to MSDC, ACBS Toronto, and the webinar production crew. In episode 3 next week, we focus on the disc-bearing propeller boat, known far and wide as the Dispro, or with great affection, the Dippy. Dippies are not known for excessive speed, but they are full of grace. As this little sequence proves, I call it the Dippy Dance. Then, on April 13th in episode 4, we visit 3 more boats demonstrating grace and speed, Eaglet 2, Dix, and Curlew. And in episode 5 on April 20th, the first of 2 episodes on Go Fast boats with Heldon 2, Rainbow 9, and Clary 2. Happy cruising, remember wood is good, and we'll see you next episode.
Well, welcome back, production team. What a wonderful episode. It looked like so much fun producing this one. It felt like I was actually in the wooden boat this week, so congratulations. We've got lots of questions in the Q&A today to answer, and the first one is, what is the definition of a gentleman's racer, and how can I tell them apart from other models?
I think Murray's the guy.
You've probably started, Anne, with the toughest question of the day. I suppose a real racer might be one that's been in competition, where a gentleman's racer, I'm going to guess, has been typically known as a fast little runabout, a sports car on the water, but not a competition one. And that may be as close as I can come, although Rick and Ed may chime in, and Ian as well, to better define that.
Well, one of the things I noticed in the documentation is that one of the first gents racers built was Shadow, for Charlie Wheaton on Lake Joseph, and he raced it. He raced it far and wide. In fact, back in those days, I think there were races, well, in the mid 30s at the CNE. And so some of them were raced early on, and they also raced at Muskoka Lakes Association races, I believe, if I recall. Ed and Rick might have information on that.
I'm sure they were, Ian. And Foots Bay as well.
And actually, in an episode coming up when we feature a few more gents racers, we'll be looking at some of the hardware that they used, and more particularly, if we can work it in, the specifications that Manette Shields used. And they were quite interesting because the specifications sort of spoke to speed and wanting to win races.
So the next question is in regards to John Hacker. And the question is that the understanding is that Mr. Hacker sold the same design or variants of it to both Manette Shields and Gravette. And a second part to the question or comment is Black Knight looks very much like a Hacker design. Is it?
Want me to take a stab at that?
Sure.
Sure.
The origin of that, as I heard it, was that Hacker designed Little Miss Canada 2 for the Wilson family, and it was built by Gravette. And I understand there were some arrangements, whatever arrangements mean, between Hacker, Gravette, and Manette Shields. And so indeed, boats like Black Knight and the other 4 or 5 that were made were in fact a Manette design. It's also worth noting that they weren't a perfect design, and you'll notice it may have shown up in the images where they had to build a little appendage on the back of the boat, at the stern of the boat, to help it stop porpoising. So it was a great design, and it's a great sporty little boat.
I think also it's worth noting that Bert Manette went to the US and studied under Hacker for a couple of years. And so they had a pretty close relationship.
Okay, our next question is what gave the boat builders and designers the inspiration for their designs?
The tough one.
Go ahead, Ed.
Their clients.
Yeah, you're right.
I think another inspiration, which I just came across sort of researching a bit for this episode, was Harry Greening. That we mentioned, like Harry Greening wanted to win races. He came up with design ideas. He went to Mr. Crouch, who was a naval architect, and then he went to Mr. Ditchburn. Well, Mr. Ditchburn saw a market, and he started building one of the boats, or some of the boats that we saw in this episode tonight. So I think inspiration came from many places. And also, you got to remember it was the 20s, and in the 20s there's a tremendous sense of confidence and a little bit of ability to pay, and so the producers, the craftsmen like Ditchburn and Manette Shields, they were challenged to meet expectations, and they did.
It's also interesting. It's also interesting to note what's below the waterline versus what's above the waterline. And while there were proven designs, especially from people like Hacker and Crouch, that would enable the boat to perform well in the water, the artistry then took over, I think, as we got up near the deck area. And that's where I think people like Bert Manette really excelled, because he was able to add his artistry to it, as did Ditchburn and so on. And a lot of owners had inputs as well in terms of the type of fittings, the chrome they wanted, the types of windshields. And so there's two parts, there's the actual performance aspect of the boat from the waterline down, and of course engine, and then you add the artistry that came above the waterline, particularly in the deck area.
And I would say the larger launches, the long deck launches, of course, they were a high-end item, and they were people of means were the ones that ordered those.
Okay, so the next question may be a little easier. The Seguin is a wooden boat. Any chance it may be included in future series?
Well, it's funny you would ask that, because I have some, I'd like to think it's great footage, but when I compare the videos I took a few years back to the videos Chris Bowen took this past summer, it doesn't quite compare. But it's a pretty nice picture of a very large wooden boat called Seguin, cruising down the Indian River. And what's kind of special about it is she, as grandchildren would say, she toots her horn. As older people like us would say, she blows her whistle. But the whistle echoes in the river, and it's pretty nice. And yes, I will incorporate that in future episodes, one way or another.
Okay, so one of our attendees tonight was involved many years ago in taking off lines on some of Muskoka's rare mahogany launches. These were done most often at Duke Boat Works, and I would like to know where those finished drawings ended up. Did they end up in our museum? Mary? Oh, you're on mute.
This was a project undertaken by the Antique and Classic Boat Society Toronto in the early 2000s, I believe. And we have all of those drawings at the Muskoka Discovery Center. We have them in large format size, in other words, poster size, but we also have them electronic. And I believe there were 8 or 9 boats done, one of each of the major manufacturers, Ditchburn, Gravette, Manette Shields, and so on. And those can be obtained through me at the Discovery Center, usually through my email, which is archives@realmuskoka.com. So we do have taking of the lines drawings there.
Great, thank you. Why do boats fly the Union Jack on their stern rather than the Canadian flag?
Well, when a lot of them were built, they were, our Canadian flag was in fact the Union Jack.
You know, and that would, if you were watching carefully in the videos, and I know you all were, you would see on the back of one of the boats that shows up, it's our boat, and it was built in 1960. It's a Duke, and that boat has an ensign on it, and that's because that was the Canadian flag at that point. Had that boat been built after 67, it would have had the current flag on it. So typically the flag flown, I think, on the stern pole is the flag that was in effect in the country the boat was produced at that time, I think. Murray?
Yes, and it's interesting to note that over the last 100 years, the flag that you spoke of with the Union Jack in the corner and then the other symbol on the center of the flag, there's been at least 3 or if not 4 different iterations of that as it's changed over time. And for those of us that are interested, we've been very fortunate to be able to get exactly the right flag through Dominion Regalia, a company in the Toronto area that has produced those kinds of flags for the Canadian government. And fortunately, they have all the information and the ability to reproduce the exact flag for those of us that want to match exactly with the year of our boat. And so it's a nice addition to make the boat authentic to the period.
How many people would have worked at Manette Shields in the heyday of boat building?
I think our archivist should answer that one, Mary, but you shook your head.
I'm really sorry, but I do not have the answer. I would say probably 8 to 10, but I'm not sure about that.
I think in the peak, I think I read it, but now I'm dragging this back, so it might not be accurate. I think it was a couple of dozen right at the peak. Bert went through some tough times in the early 20s, but when Bryson came along in the mid 20s and business boomed and we saw a product of the business at that time in today's episode, I think the numbers really got up there.
I think that's a good estimation on your part, Ian, because I think with the peak being around the 1926-27 era, when we look at the production figures of how many boats Manette put out over a winter time, and we're talking, 34 and 36 foot boats, as well as short ones. I mean, it's a phenomenal production number that I think, and Mary would have the information, but I think we were running 6 or 8 major boats that came out that winter, and you'd need a staff of the numbers that you spoke of to reach that kind of level.
Just to add to what Murray said, at the Discovery Center, we definitely have a list of how many boats were produced each year, and it's pretty accurate in our database, so we can look that up for you.
Great. How can you tell a Ditchburn boat from a Manette Shields boat?
Well, you're asking tough questions today.
Keeping you on your toes.
Yeah.
Well, they do have signature lines.
They do. There are a couple of points that I tried to learn many years ago because people kept saying to me, it just looks like a brown boat. And I said, well, no, they're different builders and they got feature lines, as Rick said. The bow stem is one of them, and it's a real giveaway. And we'll pick this up in a future episode so that we'll answer the question. And also the deck treatment is different. Like there are a whole number of ditch burns that were built with raised engine hatches and not that many Manette shields, although they were there, but there are quite a few. The hardware on Manette and Manette shield boats is very distinctive. But Murray or Rick or Ed's the guy who knows this stuff inside out. He restored the boats for decades.
Well, first of all, the bottom of the hull, which you don't see when they're in the water, they're totally different. And they run totally differently in the water. The Manette is just sort of slides to the water and doesn't kick up much water, whereas a ditch burn can be wet. I own one. But you're right. So it's the deck configuration, even the shear line, the crown on the deck. When you start looking at it, they're totally different boats.
I think when you got into the later planing boats, though, it became a different type of story from the displacement launches that you're referring to, because so much depended on who was the designer. And in the case of Ditchburn in particular, they received designs from many different people. I noticed, there were early ones from Crouch and Hacker, and then even looking at Aegis today, a few minutes ago, there has some distinctly Earl Barnes features with the overhanging deck at the stern, which is something that Earl Barnes brought in when he was doing his design work for many people in Muskoka and even down on Lake Simcoe with crates. So there's, again, this difference of whose design were the different builders commissioned to build. It all becomes a complex story.
Ed made an interesting point about what we don't see under the water. And I think it was one time when I was in Dukes with Ed, he was pointing out to me a Manette that was under restoration. He's pointing out the chine, the hard chine along the bottom of the boat towards the back, where there was a distinct angle to it. In other words, and Ed, you could describe this better than I, but on the inside of the boat where the ribs met that chine, Manette had carved out one long piece of wood, a curve on the inside where the ribs met on the inside of the boat, and on the outside it was squared off. Do I have that right, Ed?
Yeah, that's correct. And Nanawa has that feature in Eaglet, and it made the boat more stable, and it probably made it go faster as well.
Okay. The next question is a bit of a two-parter. So it is, are Manette shields and ditch burns viewed as the best and most distinctive of wooden boats? Also, are the models with long hulls and seating at the back displacement hulls?
Can you repeat that just to help us? That was a big question, Anne.
So let's just go, we'll do it in two parts, Murray. Are Manette
Yeah.
shields and ditch burns viewed as the best and most distinctive of wooden classics?
I can jump in and say that I think they're the two that are probably recognized in the eyes of the public. When you get into the quality and what is the best, if it was a racer, was it the fastest? It was a displacement boat, was it the smoothest? Then you get into fit and finish. But there were other builders that built some exceptional boats. We saw Bornemann boats last week. There are some Earl Barnes boats that are quite exceptional, and the list goes on. Ed and Rick and Ed, you can add much more than I can there.
Yeah,
Well, there are also some American boats. Thea and Bowen comes to mind, who built some similar style boats. Gilbert in Eastern Ontario. Ed, you know more than I do.
Well, one that came to mind is that Corvette. It was one of a kind that was built. Oh, I can't remember the name of it. It's in the U.S., but it was stunning. Do you remember the name of that, Murray? It was down at I think the first Toronto Boat Show.
Was that the Maltese Falcon by chance?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's a very stunning boat, I think.
Well, we're going to meet a stunning boat a couple of episodes out, which is Curlew, built by Gravette.
Mhm. Yeah, same thing. Yeah, same idea. Okay, next half of the question.
Okay. Are the models with long hulls and seating at the back displacement hulls?
Well, normally a displacement hull has a round bottom, so when you look at the boat from the back, it looks round. Whereas displacement boats tend to be, and we've talked about having the square corners, tend to get up on the top of the water and skim across the top of the water, as opposed to sitting down in the water and displacing literally the water around them.
I suppose, Rick, the only exception to that are some of the Manette launches where he started out with a boat that was very displacement at the bow. And then there was the most subtle transition I've ever seen in a boat, where it transitioned from being a displacement launch and suddenly, or gradually rather, this hard chine appeared, which gave the boat stability. But due to the entry point of the boat and the angle of shaft and so on, it stayed as a displacement boat. And in some ways, Manette captured the best of both in a magical way that I guess Manette was known for.
Murray, I think you nailed it there, and I think we see an example of that in Scud 2. Would that be correct on my part? I think Scud sort of demonstrates what you're saying.
I was going to use Eaglet or Nanawa as an example of that, because I think they both had the hard chine at aft.
You're right. Yeah, Scud's hard chine is all the way back, and the reason I mentioned Scud is promotion for a future episode, because we'll see quite a large Manette Shields, beautiful boat with the original engine at speed. But you're right, Murray, the hard chine starts far forward and extends all the way to the stern.
It's basically a V bottom
Yes.
hard chine boat.
Okay, some boats have at a high speed a big rooster tail, and some have the bow stick above the water a lot. Does this have to do with the position of the prop?
Dear.
I think that's an Edward question.
Oh. Oh dear. That's a tough-
Ed, I just want to put this in, because then you can describe why it happens. We saw the Lady Elgin in tonight's episode. I had the great pleasure, when I was a very young chap, of driving Lady Elgin one summer. And when she didn't have a load, you saw her in this episode today, she ran very flat with very little, no rooster tail to speak of. Now, when you put 20 people in that boat, which we routinely did, and you gave her some power, Lady Elgin was well known as throwing one of the bigger rooster tails anywhere in the lakes. Just ask the people on the boathouses we went by. So Ed, you can maybe address that now in terms of design and the way the boats are outfitted with power.
Well, I think the answer is a typical example of a displacement boat. In other words, you have this 36-foot launch with one person in it, and then you put 20 people in it. It's just going to displace more water and make a larger weight.
Okay. So the last question tonight is requested to go to Murray, and to have you talk a little bit about Tim Chisholm and his contribution to the wooden boat legacy.
You certainly targeted me there. I met Tim probably 25, maybe 30 years ago. And to me, Tim was one of those early collectors who came to Muskoka, was enamored by the boats, and was egged on by the late John Blair into collecting a number of boats. And fortunately, John was a real aficionado that way and was able to direct Tim into some exceptional boats. Tim liked the overall aesthetics of the boats. He liked the importance of the boats. And I think, to be fair, I think he loved the attention that the boats gave. But under John's tutelage and Ed's skill at the shop, Tim, expanded his knowledge. He was an exceptional collector. And fortunately, he had people like Ed that did exceptional restorations for him. And because he was such a colorful character, I think we tend to associate, really great boats with Tim. The two were symbiotic that way. And that was part of the magic of Tim. And I think those of us that knew him quite miss him that way.
To add to that, Murray, when Rick and I first took over Duke's, Charlevon was the first restoration we ever did, and it was for Tim Chisholm. So
Thank
Good.
you, everyone. Okay, John, next up to you.
Oh, sorry, that was the last one.
That was the last one.
There was just one more I wanted to see the answer if anyone knew.
Oh,
It's from an old, a former board member of ours, Al Manchi. Does anyone know the make of the boat from, it says on Golden Pound, but I'm assuming that means on Golden Pond. Does anyone know the make of that boat?
Chris Craft.
Correct.
Speak to
Wonderful.
Rick, he just happened to have one.
There we go.
Rick can tell us more. Rick, you can nail it right down to the model number, can't you?
Well, they were
U2.
called U-22.
Yeah.
U-22
And I understand.
long.
As a little sidebar, I understand there were 4 or 5, maybe more boats like that were lined up for the movie. A number of them were ruined as they were doing take after take of the boat, running on the rocks. And I think the gentleman who assembled those boats and restored them was a gentleman named Skip Gogger. This is now going back, I guess it's almost 50 years ago. But that Rick's right about everything. And that's the little sidebar about just how many boats were actually used to make On Golden Pond.
Great information. Okay, well, thank you to all our panelists for another wonderful episode. Thank you to our audience. We had over 200 people on again tonight. I think next week it's the Dispro, disappearing propeller boat. So we look forward to welcoming everyone back next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. And have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.